Okay. So what Sarah and Tammy and the steering committee asked me to do was to present to you all, you may have heard discussion of what's come to be known as NARS 2.0, and they wanted to have a better understanding for you all of kind of why we have offered an option to change how we're implementing the field work. And it really relates to the increased interest now that we've been running a number of years in trends and the ability of the program to detect trends. So important to think about this as we discuss it, in that the power to detect trends is really telling us, so how likely are we to detect a trend of a certain magnitude if it occurs? And so it lets us be proactive in terms of our design, because we don't know how big of trends are going to be out there, or if we're going to see trends, but we have some general feeling for, yeah, but we'd like to see trends of a certain size. If they occur, can we do everything we can to kind of increase the likelihood of that? Note that this is not the same as saying we have detected a trend of Y. It's, so what's the likelihood of detecting that trend if it should occur? We've detected a trend of Y is a post-occurrence thing that you can do, and you may have been able to detect a trend smaller than that, or not. But they're two different questions, and that's kind of what's driving us. Let me shut off my mail because that's going to be pretty annoying. So we got, let me describe kind of where we currently are with NARS in terms of implementation. So you're all familiar with the survey design that is being used. It's essentially kind of the easiest thing to describe it as is a stratified random design with regional level of resolution. There's some details missing when we explain it at that level, because we do stratify even farther because we want to be able to do replacement of sites by individual sites. But the guts of the approach is really essentially a stratified random design. The implementation approach that we're using is one that says we're going to visit one resource in 1 year, all of the sites for that resource, and we're going to repeat it every 5 years. Except, of course, for rivers and streams, we've chosen to sample over 2 years, which essentially gives us double the sample size that we have in the other resource areas. Important to, in this discussion, know that these two are related, but they are not the same thing. There is nothing in our current survey design that dictates whether we implement it once every 5 years or we implement it over a course of multiple years like we're doing with rivers and streams, or spread it out even farther. And the same is true of the implementation approach. It's not dependent on the survey design. Do they interact? Sure, but they're not one and the same thing. So we can have the discussion that we're going to really have about NARS 2.0 is really one about the implementation approach, not a fundamental change in the survey design. So the slides I'm going to show you on power go back to answering questions about the variance components of the data. That really is based on a paper that we published back in 1995. And it talks about what are the components of variance that come out of, that are buried within the data that we collect, and how would we represent those. So there's the residual, which is kind of the noise that we all work about. There's the lake year or estuary year interaction. That's basically how much do individual systems bounce up and down from year to year, independent of one another. There's the component, which is what we call the lake or the water body component. That's how much do lakes and streams move up and down together. And then there's the year component. How different are things year to year? Things that we need to know in that are how many sites are you going to visit? How many years are you looking at it? How many times do you visit during a year? And then the estimate of the variance. I'm only showing this kind of detail to you because some of you are going to have an interest in looking at it with your own data for your particular states. All of that gets summarized into this equation where variance is the variance of your estimate of the slope of the trend. So how variable is that slope estimate is really kind of the uncertainty you have about the trend that you're seeing. The value in knowing this kind of formulation that it allows us to decide where do we get the most bang for our buck in terms of site visits. Are we better off visiting sites multiple times in a year versus increasing the number of sites versus the number of years? So this is the background for what we've done and informs it all. And for those of you who have a lot more interest in that detail for your own programs, we can talk offline about that and help you with that. What's been happening is Tony Olson and Tom Kincaid, who does a lot of our statistical work, have been taking the data sets that have been accumulated in NARS to date, and for each resource group, extracting these variance components for each of the indicators. The data I'm going to show you today are largely from rivers and streams and lakes, but the same is being done for coastal waters and for wetlands as we get the second round analyzed. So that's the data behind. Show you this kind of outline here. This is going to be in each of the slides that you will see here shortly. So there'll be a designation when we're talking about a design that is a sample every year. There's a designation of 5Y for design where we're sampling once every 5 years. And then there are a bunch of variations on particularly the annual samples, whether it's some kind of rotating panel that are each of which are visited in different years, whether we replace some of the sites where we have or have a fixed panel where all of the same sites are visited every year, or some combination. You don't need to remember these because I'll point them out, but there's a particular design option we've looked at that maximizes both status and trends over time. So this is an example of the figures you'll see, and I'll go through it in a little detail for you. So on the x-axis is time. On the y-axis is the power to detect a trend. So a 20% power basically says there's a probability of 20% of detecting a trend of a certain magnitude after X number of years, or at that point in time. So this analysis assumes we're starting in 2012, just as an example. Up at the top, there's a designation of the indicator we're looking at. So in this particular case, it's total nitrogen. We're looking at an alpha level of 0.05, so detecting, being confident essentially at the 95% level. And then you have to do these, you have to designate, so what's the magnitude of the trend that is buried in the data that you would be trying to detect? So in this particular example, I'm saying there's a 0.5% trend, a linear trend in the data. So what's the power to detect it after a certain period of time? So all of the figures look like this. All of them have the same pattern, that these bottom two lines represent the two variations of visiting once every 5 years. The upper four lines are variations of the visiting, doing sampling every year. So you can see in this case for total nitrogen, assuming there's a trend of about 0.5%, you can see up until about 10 years into it, 9 years into it, the power doesn't change at all. After that point, it really begins to separate whether you visit it annually or every 5 years, with a pretty marked increase in the power to detect trend over time. One thing I should point out, we've plotted these 5-year ones as a smooth curve, but in fact, they're a step change that only changes every 5 years. So it actually should be a flat line coming out 5 years, then it jumps up a little bit, flat for another 5 years, jumping up, flat for another 5 years. So the 5-year one is not a smooth curve, it's more of a step. The annual one is in fact a smooth, much more smooth curve. So that's a template for the ones I'm going to show you. This next figure is total nitrogen again, and what we've done is said, let's look for a trend of 0.2%, a trend in the middle figure of 0.5%, and then on the right-hand side, a trend of 1%. It's exactly the same pattern. The bottom two curves are every 5 years in each of these, and the upper curves are the 4 variations of an annual visit. So same pattern, you get to see a pretty marked increase in power over time for any of these, depending on the magnitude of the trend. One of the things that we do see as a pattern is that as the trends become larger and larger, 1% change annually over time, the more the sets of curves merge, basically telling you if you've got a really large trend, it doesn't matter what survey design you have, you'll see it in those. So generally what people will ask is, yeah, but I'm looking for much smaller trends than that. So these types of figures in the left two are will be the ones you'll look at. That's total nitrogen. For benthos, same thing, 0.2% change, 0.5, and 1%. Here, it's interesting, again, the bottom two are the 5-year curves. There's a bit more spread for benthos in the annual ones. And you can see that as well. There's a split here. The pattern's about the same, but the variation in the annual designs. And for benthos, the two approaches begin to merge pretty quickly over time. But in all cases, there's a marked benefit in power to detect trends going to an annual sampling. This figure, excuse me, is looking at assuming there's a linear trend, or let's assume even if we're sampling annually, we just want to estimate change every 5 years in 5-year blocks. Kind of what you do now in 303D lists and current 305B reports. You aggregate data for a couple years and then you talk about what you've seen. So these two figures have they're the same indicator, total nitrogen, same level of trend that we're trying to pick up, 0.2%. The only difference is in the left-hand one, we're looking for a linear trend. So here's the power to detect that. In the right-hand one, we're just looking for change in blocks of time. And the power is much greater when you've said, okay, I just need to be able to detect that change in each 5-year chunk of time. So I think that's kind of useful information as well. Here's the same pattern for benthos that we saw before. Here, what's of interest is, again, the power is a little lower for linear trends. If you were interested more in kind of 5-year chunks of change, that power goes up dramatically. And my guess is over the next decade, we'll have some combination of those that we're interested in looking at. Is almost always the case in programs that are in their early stages of change and trend detection. This figure is just a slight variation that I put in here because I think it helps dramatize the difference between 1 year and 2 years. So the bottom axis is that magnitude of the trend. So in the last set of slides, I had a different figure for each different size of trend. Here we've plotted those on the x-axis, power still on the y, and we've said, how does, in 2019, if we started in 2012, how's the power to detect trends of different magnitudes vary between the current option and the sample every year option? And you can see here pretty dramatic difference in your power to detect trend between the 1 year option and the 5-year option that we currently have. And this is running it out another, if you're talking about power by the year 2024 to detect these different sizes of trends. Again, that separation between the annual and the every 5 years kind of current scenario are pretty dramatic, regardless of what power you want to detect. So some people have asked, so if we were to do that, what would the sampling effort look like in individual states? So what I did was go to the last sets of surveys, just pick a couple, I think I've got 6 states as an example. So in the left-hand column are what we currently do. So Iowa, for example, if we were to start this in 2022 or just look at it from there on, if we continued our current scenario, 15 lakes in 2022, 4 rivers and streams in 2023 and 24, there'd be 19 sites, 20. Iowa doesn't do any coastal work, and they'd have wetlands with a sample size of 12. If you were to shift to the different implementation strategy that power detection analysis would suggest is better, you'd essentially just divide these numbers by 5 and spread that out over 5 years. So you'd have 3 lakes every year. You'd have 8 rivers and streams. If you want to exactly match these numbers, one of those years would be lower. No coastal and 2 or 3 wetland sites. So one of the things you'll see throughout these examples is that the sample size within a state stabilizes, so it's the same every year, whereas it has the likelihood of jumping around a little bit every year based on what we're currently doing. This is the picture for Minnesota. They currently do 50 lakes, 32 and 32 streams, 11 essentially coastal or Great Lake sites, and then 26 wetlands. That would stabilize and look something like this for Minnesota. Oklahoma, kind of same pattern. Things stabilize in terms of number of sites that they visit, but of course it's in 3 different resource types. Kansas, again, very similar pattern, but the numbers stabilize for them. Sometimes it stabilizes at about the same number that they have in any individual year. Whether you want to argue 16 is much different than 22 or 3, certainly 10 is, but that changes. Examples for Virginia and Alabama, which have coastal water bodies. Again, it just spreads those sampling out. So that's a little sense of what it would look like for different states and we can produce those data for all the states if you'd like a table that shows that. But that's an approximation of how the logistical effort, sampling effort, would change from state to state. So implications for implementation, there's one of the one-year panels, which is basically a pretty large different set of sites every year. It maximizes, get 4 visits over a 15-year period. It's a pretty attractive option in terms of maximizing power, maximizing status, and the number of visits. What it means is that there's a portion of all resources visited every year within a state. This is really kind of an all or nothing in the sense that all of the states do it or none of us make the change. I think one of the other implications is that we have more options in terms of reporting. So we could report the results every year for all resources, whether you do that just for that year's sampling or once you're up and running, do something like a rolling 5-year rolling average and report that every year. But you'd also have the option of saying, yeah, we're getting the samples every year, but we want to spread our reports for resources out, so it's a different resource we report on every year. Those kinds of things are still an option. Point being that you have a lot more flexibility, I think. So potential upsides, from my perspective, you got a greater power for trend detection. Estimates of what's going on are available every year, and whether you just use, again, that year's sampling or you develop some kind of rolling average over or rolling estimate over a 4 on reporting. I believe it gives us more flexibility in reacting to budgets. So rather than a decrease in the budget this year impacting just one resource type, we can take the hit across resource types. It provides a little more flexibility for responding to environmental issues. Other work points out, hey, here's an issue, I wonder how widespread it is. So if it's in rivers and streams and we just finished that, in essence, you have to wait 5 years to do it again. If you're doing it every year, you have the ability to get out that next year, add some indicators and see where you stand. I think this approach is actually more consistent with what most federal, state, and tribal monitoring implementation actually is. Most of you sample portion of your resource every year, even when it's site-specific monitoring as opposed to a state-level survey. I know BLM, which is implementing this, they're doing a subset of their samples every year. So I think it's more consistent. It is, however, a change, so potential downsides. We are now, 14, 13 years into doing NARS together, so talking about a change like this is always a problematic. Downside is that basically we're saying in terms of doing this, it's all or nothing. That doesn't mean necessarily that we couldn't, as a set of partners, say, well, let's try one of the resources this way for a while, keep the others on their schedule, and ease into it. Might be an option. There's some funding issues that are related to that, but you'd try and sort those out. I suspect that as we talk about this, it's going to be harder for some states, easier for others. For states who have different kind of units within your organization that sample the different water body types, this might actually make it easier. If you got a unit that does all water body types, this might make it more difficult, but that's part of the discussion. Challenge in that everybody needs to handle all resources all the time. There is now, if we do this, less flexibility in implementing the panels. So if you think about rivers and streams and what we currently do, we have a chunk of sites that have to be visited in those 2 years, And even though our preference would be to give you the sites that are visited in year 1 and the sites that visited in year 2, we've never really worried about that. In this scenario, we would worry about it. This is the set of sites that's visited this year, a different set next year for each of the 5 years. And then finally, in terms of downsides, there are some unknowns. So let me describe what I think those are. I'm sure you will have more. I don't know how this impacts funding allocation. At first blush, it looks like it would smooth out the variation in sample sizes and therefore funding by state if you went that route, but there are complications just in terms of the mechanics of getting the grants in every year and all that. So unknown implications from my perspective there. It's going to be a different issue in terms of contracting. I think there are some implications or impact on training. If we're doing every resource every year, do we have the same level of training requirement? We certainly have 4 different resource types to train, but maybe we feel like collectively that the crews don't need training every year because they're doing that resource every year. I do know it has a big impact on staff, whether that's the state and tribal staff or the federal staff. And then we've got to work through how to handle reporting. So all of these, I think, are things that are unknown and the kinds of things that we wanted to have pretty open discussions with you all. So Tammy, I will stop there.
Great, thank you, Steve. We didn't have any questions come up while you were presenting, and now's your chance. And what I can do is, if you prefer not to type your question, I can certainly unmute and have you speak. So let me, there you go. Are there questions? Okay.
And it may.
Oh, you're cutting out, Steve.
Yes?
Oh, no, you're back. Sorry.
I'm here.
Okay. Let me get to the, so we have a question. I'm going to go ahead and unmute Valerie Harcher.
Yeah.
Hi. Hi. Just a couple of quick questions. One, it looked as though the plans were to start this after the end of the current cycle, so after 2021?
To me, that's a good time to, if you decide to do this, that would be a good time to do it because we'd have gotten through everything kind of 3 times. So that would make sense, but I suspect that's up for discussion.
Okay, so the plan would be for the 2020 coastal to be done as it has been in previous 5-year cycles.
That's what Tony and I were thinking, is just make the break at a particular point in time. Which one you pick is kind of arbitrary. Our preference is to make sure all of the resources have been done 3 times. So that means getting through the next round of wetlands.
Okay, great. And then what assumptions of revisits were in your curves? I didn't catch all of the translations of the codes. And
you couldn't read that fine print. Yeah, the analyses that we did there were 4 different scenarios for the annual visiting, and they each had a different assumption. So one of them was there's a completely new independent panel every year and there's no linkage between them. Another is that it's exactly the same panel every year, so the total number of individual sites we do is reduced dramatically, which has lots of implications on your regional resolution. So I think that one's out. And then the other 2 were combinations. So one was 50% of the sites are linked every year but they're kind of done in pairs. And then a third one was, let's have a block set of like 10% that are revisited every year and are pretty stable in there. So those level of details, I think we would want to collectively kind of work through. This was an initial pass at, so how dramatically different, if at all, are those curves given different options? And as you saw, for the most part, having a visit every year, whether they're all new or the same sites, is pretty much the driver, and the rest is in the details.
Thanks. Could you tell me the second one again, the one that you said is more problematic?
Oh, if we were to say, let's visit the same set of sites every year in each of the 5 years.
Oh, okay.
The reason I think that is problematic is that decreases the total number of different sites. So if we do 1,000 lakes, for example, and you split that up so you visit 200 every year, it'd be the same 200 lakes every year. So
Right.
your ability to have any regional resolution disappears really quickly, because it's just 200 sites spread across the country. So.
Got it. Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Hey, you're welcome.
We've got a few more questions, and I can unmute everyone. I just was trying to not unmute everyone in case there were some background noise. But Dave Chestnut has a question, so I can't, unfortunately, didn't have a pen, but his question is, one big issue will be where a state uses a different sample frame for each water resource than the NARS frame. South Carolina has been doing a state scale design for about 16 years, started before NARS, and we have a long record based on our design. Could you address how more flexibility to budgets? Oops, I'm sorry, end question.
From my perspective, because there are a number of states who have that, they have basically asked us to use this frame for their part of the national survey. And where that is happening, I don't see any reason why we couldn't continue to do that. Because as Tony does the sampling now, all the replacements are by state, so that kind of flexibility should continue. I think those are that's a really good example, Dave, of the kind of detail that we'll have to get into. But where we have the flexibility to do something now, there's absolutely no reason that shouldn't continue. Because again, and it's why I mentioned the difference between the survey design and the implementation of it. I view this not as any change in what we're doing in any part of the design. The change is in how we're choosing to implement it, whether we do it all at once or spread it out over 4 or 5 years. So I think should still be good.
Thank you. And then, Sarah, I also have you unmuted as well if you had any other questions. Part of Dave's question, the final part, was changing will require a great deal of internal discussion.
Yeah, so. I think that's absolutely true, because the implications for the states and tribes and the various staff are pretty significant. And then, I think the upsides are there, but there is no doubt that it's a big change from what we're doing.
You had a question as well, so I have you unmuted, but her question was how would this affect logistics of supply and sample shipment?
I'm sorry, Tammy, that was kind of my end garbled, so I didn't quite hear that.
Okay, I'm unmuted, so I can just go ahead and ask. I just was wondering how this would affect the sort of logistics of supplies for the surveys and shipping samples, and it seems like the way it works now is, there's a certain set of samples that are being generated in a year for one type of aquatic resource. So the logistics of that might get really complicated if we're trying to do multiple resources a year.
Yep, I think you are absolutely right. I think that's one of among the issues, especially on the logistical side. So, for the various labs that receive samples, they've got to be very good about making sure that it's clear, hey, these are coastal waters, these are wetland samples, so all of that's got to be worked through.
And I guess just to follow up on that, also in terms of training, I know for the wetland surveys, the training was very rigorous. And so to have that level of training every year would be difficult, but to not have that level of training every year might reduce the level of precision of the teams.
I think that's a good perspective and good comment. And I think one of the arguments that could be made is that, we still have to have that level of training every year because it's so critical. A different perspective would be, but we're not asking them now to wait for 5 years before they do that again. So, some level of retention of what they're doing should occur, and that we need to kind of come up with some way to do a less intense refresher training. Maybe we get all of the training, both field and kind of in the office training, on video, so it's easier to present it. I think we have to work through that. There's no doubt it's an issue. You can't do what we currently do now every year for all 4 resources. And the question will be, so how should we change it to accommodate that if this is a decision that, the partnership decides to move ahead with?
Cool.
And I should emphasize that. I know some people have said, well, it sounds like this is a done deal. And I don't think it is. The science part of it tells me that it's a pretty clear decision, but we all know that's not the only thing going on here, and it can't be in a partnership. So I think it's a decision that still has to be made, one way or the other.
And then Leslie McGeorge asked a question. I don't know how similar is, and you're unmuted, Leslie. Is that answer your question as well?
Is this progress report 1 or progress report 2, and for which one?
I think that it might be a little bit different of a question. Before we get to that, I just wanted to agree with Dave Chestnut in terms of these changes would take a lot of discussions internally here in New Jersey too. One of the things I'm thinking about is different units, different programs do the different monitoring resource categories, and some of them hire seasonal employees just for that year out of the farm. So I'm not saying this couldn't work. I think it's a very important question to address about the change in implementation to improve trends, but it certainly would require a lot of internal discussion. My question was, I think you mentioned one of the potential benefits could be more flexibility with budget changes. And I'm trying to determine how you see that could be beneficial if there's budgetary changes, year to year. How would we respond to that and still ensure a stable data collection process over many years for the NARS?
Yeah, and that's a good question, Leslie, and maybe benefit wasn't the best way to phrase that. No budget reduction is going to be beneficial to us collectively. What I guess what I was suggesting is, right now this year's budget funds next year's field sampling. If we, for example, were to take, get hit by a 10 or 20% drop in the budget this year, currently the only way we really have to respond is that, so for whatever resource type is sampling next year, they got a 20% cut. They got to figure out how to do fewer sites or fewer indicators or something. So it impacts a particular water resource type. And if that happened to be a one-time budget cut, that impacts that group that year. If it's a one-time cut in this example, what I meant was that, so all of the resource types are impacted that particular year, which I think from a program perspective is a little better than having one of them absorb the entire hit. So that's what I meant. Whether we need to take that out of potential upsides, I'm happy to do it. But that's what I was trying to get at with that statement or that example.
Thank you.
Hey, you bet. And I completely agree with you that this is going to take internal discussions within each state and tribe to decide. So does that mesh better with what we do if I only had, 5 lakes I had to sample as opposed to 50, but I got the resources to do them every year? Or is that a good thing or a bad thing? You all have to have those discussions. One of the reasons we're doing these kind of webinars this far in advance of the meeting in December was so that people would have a chance to just kind of think about this and have some of those internal discussions. Not sure you'll be able to have them all at the level you want, but this gives you a little more detailed heads up to begin those conversations. So I don't think anybody was expecting folks would make a decision in the next month, but that you'd have the time to reflect on it.
I think that's really helpful. Thank you very much. I do think it might be helpful for every state to receive one of those tables that you're talking about in terms of the logistical sampling efforts. It's not that we don't know our numbers, but it's nice to see it presented that clearly. That would be really helpful.
Okay, I can do that pretty easily.
I think it's really going to depend on the states. I mean, some states aren't doing anything when there's a coastal sampling period. Some states are responsible for a lot more numbers than others, depending on the state. And some states, as you said, clearly are, the monitoring is done out of maybe one program or unit, and others it's really scattered. So I'm sure every state will be unique. Thank you.
And I think that, thanks, Leslie, that's important to understand. I also think, I kind of made the statement of it's all or nothing, and more of what I meant by that is, for a particular resource type, we all go to this sampling scheme or we don't. But as we currently do now, for some resource types, some states do the sampling and some opt to have in-kind services with a contractor. And for a different resource type, their decision may be different. That they decide, for that resource type, hey, go ahead and use the money for in-kind services. As long as we get the data, we don't need to be involved in the sampling, but we definitely want to be involved in the sampling for this other type. I think that same thing, there's flexibility to have that same thing happen now, maybe even more. Maybe it's the kind of thing that the decision depends on the year about whether you want in-kind services for contractors rather than resource type, or you change the decision year by year depending on the resource type. There are lots of more complicated scenarios you can kind of think about, but I think those flexibilities should still be there.
We had a great comment from Linda Bacon in Maine, and she said, and I believe her as well, it would be a lot easier to implement.
Tammy, we're having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. We got a comment from Linda Bacon at Maine, and she said it would be a lot easier for Maine to implement. We are organized by water body type. The 5-year rotation requires that we drop almost all our other monitoring to participate. It would be a lot easier to just devote 2 weeks to NARS. So
and I think, thanks, Linda. I think that's a good example where in Maine you're organized in a way that this would be beneficial or easier to absorb and deal with. So it's good to know.
The next question we had is from Chris Jensen, and she asked, and I will unmute her as well, have you had any thoughts about the data availability on an annual basis? The whole process of producing and making available the data on an annual basis?
That's a good question, Chris. One of the things that we've discussed, but I don't think gotten very far in the decision process. Right now, what we do is we wait until the full data set for resource type it's kind of gone through the initial processing and kind of as close as we can to the final QA. At that stage, all of them are made available to the state and tribal partners, and then once the final report's done, it's available to the public. I think if you go this route, we have to reconsider that. At a minimum, given what we're currently doing, I think we need to find a way to say, as the data sets are completed, and we sort of do this in some areas and not in others, but if the chemistry is the first data set that's done and completed, that ought to be released as soon as possible rather than waiting till the draft of the report. And I think you're going to have the same issue annually, that you want them to become available much more quickly. And so I think this would give you some additional options along that way. There's part of me knowing how the QA works. There's part of me that has a little angst because we rely on all of the chemistry data to do some of the QA checks. And without all of the data, harder to do that. But I think you just do it. You get used to this is the level of QA that is going to happen. And when it's done, and it's available annually. But I think that's part of a decision that collectively has got to get made.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Kevin Goodwin in Michigan. Is there a thought regarding the frequency that grants would be awarded? Still annual?
Good question, Kevin, and I'm glad to say I have not the faintest idea. So Sarah or Susan?
No. Now this is going to be on you, Steve. I'm giving this a no.
Oh, giving me that job.
Kevin, thank you. So part of that would need to be a broader discussion with all of the regions because they're the ones who issue those grants. They have the option right now of doing 2-year grants. They may even be able to do longer ones. I just don't know. Clearly, as our budgets shift over that time period, though, we would be funding incrementally, and so it is possible that modifications would need to be made if we either got more or less money than we originally estimated. But there is flexibility in order to do longer than just annual grants to hopefully cut down on some of that burden. But that's definitely something I wouldn't want to do without discussing with the regions who are the people who implement that portion for us, along with you all.
Any other question on that, Kevin?
Nope.
Okay. The question is from Terrence Fleming, and he says, Steve, if I read the slides right, it looks like we gain about an increase of 20% of power over 10 years. This seems somewhat modest to me. Can you comment on this? And he's also
yeah, probably not very effectively. I'd have to go back and look at which particular one and look at the variance components to really answer that effectively. So, sorry.
Maybe if the, and I apologize, I missed who wrote in that question, but perhaps if you want, either if you're unmuted or if you want to type in and just provide more details on, if you remember which example it was, or else maybe we can talk offline with Steve.
Oh, it was me. It was Terry. I was just looking at the slides that were presented. I can't remember which one it was, but I was sort of eyeballing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we can look at, I mean, all of these we can basically look at and redo the analysis in more details depending on questions come up. Because part of what you have to do is assume a starting date and go from there. So it would vary.
Okay.
And if there are other, if there are, one of the things we had talked about, kind of relevant to Dave and Leslie's points of needing internal discussions, when Mike really pushed us to kind of make sure we do this as early as possible, I had offered that, I'm willing to repeat these kinds of webinars. So particularly if you have more detailed questions come up, either about the power parts of it or any of the other parts, pros or cons, if you want more conversations about them, we can always do another webinar that allows us collectively to delve into some of the details. So if you all have questions like that and can get them to Tammy and Sarah, we can work on those kinds of things.
great. And I think time maybe for one last question from Elizabeth Belk. And she said, how would moving to sampling each resource type every year positively or negatively affect the ability to otherwise evolve the surveys, such as adding or dropping indicators?
My bias in the answer is that I think it provides more flexibility. I think one of the things as we move into the next phase of NARS, whether we make any changes or not, one of the things I think we have to do is to say, all right, the way we calculate this particular indicator and its threshold, we want to have that stabilized for a period of years. Not that we won't allow changes as the science evolves, but we want that not to happen each and every year or each and every survey. We want a little more careful pattern of doing some overlap studies. So I think regardless, we want to build that in so everything doesn't change frequently, but we yet still have the ability to react to improvements in the science. I think it gives us a lot more flexibility to respond to emerging issues where people say, hey, just saw a report that says these particular things are occurring in spots. We really ought to be in a position to say how widespread they are. Can we add that measurement to the surveys for all resource types for the next couple years or just to one of them? So rather than waiting, till that resource starts up again, you can start that right away. Similarly, if we, as we're doing the analysis on the data, find, these particular variables just don't change much, can we do them less frequently? I think there are lots of discussions about that that you would want to have, but I think you have more opportunity to respond to that by having something that happens every year. But that's my opinion. I'm sure somebody would have a different perspective that that sees it differently.
Great, thank you, Steve. And to be respectful of everyone's time, we have hit the hour that we've been. If people still have questions after the webinar, should they be emailing Sarah and I or you directly, Steve? What's the best process?
Up to you, I think. If they have questions about the power analysis and those kinds of things or sample sizes, they can email me directly, and Tony and I can talk about them. And if they're more on the, well, how would we handle grants or training or whatever, those are not things that I do a lot. So your choice, you and Sarah, how you want to do that.
Okay.
I will be producing those tables that Leslie asked for every state, and I will get those to you, and you all can figure out how you want to distribute them.
And what I'll also do is I will upload, I'll have to convert the recording, and I will upload this to the website, and I will send a link to that as well. And Sarah, did you have any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I just wanted, if folks do have questions, even if they're the more technical, detailed ones, if you send them to Steve, if you wouldn't mind seeing Tammy and me, or at least one of us, because I want to make sure that we're getting and keeping track of all the types of questions that we have and the types of responses that have been given to date, so that we can provide that out to other folks as well who may have similar questions.
Maybe that's just a good practice. If you got those, send it to the three of us.
Okay.
Any question, just send it to all three of us.
You can ignore the grants question.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, no, thank you, everybody. You can also give a call if you've got feedback that you want to provide. Send in comments and questions. And Tammy, do you want to just provide the information on when the meeting is, the Silver Spring date?
The meeting is December 5th through 7th. I have the draft agenda online, which I will send you that as well. Keeping in mind, for those who are making travel, we are going to start at 8 o'clock on that Tuesday morning. And it's going to go until 5 o'clock on Thursday. So if you're thinking of these or other things, and it will be at Silver Spring, the training will be at the NOAA Center. I will send you that information as it gets a little closer as to what room and a little more logistical things. And if you need a hotel room, you will need to, if you're not a scholarship recipient or federal employee, you will have to contact me, unfortunately. So that's kind of what we negotiated with the hotel. And the hotel is the Hampton on Colesville Road in Silver Spring. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Steve. We appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. And again, if everybody thinks there would be value in repeating some parts of this or having more detailed discussion of parts, glad to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.